Let's begin. All right. So, hey everyone, and welcome to the Hands-On Hour with the Canadian Cloud community. I'm Samir Makwana, and I have my uh, a very good friend Mohammed. We both are hosts for this online event, or I would say ongoing event. And today we have Steve Pucelik, and thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today.
Sure.
Uh, I'm happy and thrilled to welcome you as our guest today. Uh, and rather than I provide the introduction of Steve, I would let Steve introduce himself and kick off the session. Yeah, thank you, Steve.
Awesome. Thanks, Samir. Thanks, Mohammed. I appreciate it. And super excited to be here. Nothing more I like to do than give a demo and let's get straight into it, right? So we're going to go deep in what SharePoint Embedded is, how I've created a few things, what the API looks like, where all the moving parts are. Everything is on the table here. But with that, I'm Steve Pucelik, Senior Product Manager on the SharePoint Embedded team at Microsoft. Super excited to be a part of the platform, seeing how it's evolving, developing, and so forth. So I've been with Microsoft for about 10 years in various roles, from the content services days to the field days. So I've been doing quite a bit of customer interaction, but I'm also a developer. And if I go back, years and years before, when the SharePoint Seesaw model was there, and a lot of other tools that we had to create solutions within SharePoint, we created them in SharePoint, right? So if we wanted to interact with the document models, document management models, and the files that are in SharePoint, we had ways to do that, right? So over the years, I've always used SharePoint as kind of that document repository, even when creating custom applications. When I saw SharePoint Embedded come out, I'm like, okay, this is going to be pretty darn cool, right? Because now I can use all the goodness and everything that's in SharePoint Embedded for managing documents, but I don't have to worry about the UI in SharePoint. I can create whatever I want. And that's how the things have been evolving. And that's where ISVs and partners and developers are really starting to gravitate towards that. And that's where we're going to go today. So I do have a lot of solutions that I'm going to walk through, somewhat rapid fire, but we'll be able to really demonstrate what's the creation process look like, what's created in Azure, how are we going to use that within our custom applications, what are we going to use within Foundry to surface some of the AI goodness on top of the documents we store in SharePoint Embedded. And then we're going to throw in some Power Platform just for good measure, because we have the Power Platform connectors that went GA earlier this year. I want to make sure we talk about that. So all of that is where we're headed next. And if there are questions or thoughts, keep the chat active. Samir, interrupt, throw something, whatever the case is there. I want to make sure we get our questions answered in the process. All right. Cool. Alrighty, so let's roll. I'm going to start off in Visual Studio Code and a couple different entry points that we can use within the creation of our SharePoint Embedded environment. Right now, Visual Studio Code is going to be the easiest place to do that. I will bounce over to SharePoint Admin Center here in a minute, and we're going to see what's coming here literally in probably the next 30 days. But in Visual Studio Code, go ahead and download the SharePoint Embedded extension, plug that into your environment just like you would any other extension, and it's going to ask you to authenticate to your tenant. Okay, so this is where we're going to authenticate into your tenant, and you're going to see the container types that have been created in your specific tenant. So I've got a number of them that I've already created. Today we're going to focus on my legal environment, but if you wanted to right mouse click on the container types and create the trial container types, that's going to walk you through all of the steps. And I think there's 3 steps to create that trial container type. And it's just that, it's a trial container type. You don't need a subscription to get started. It'll create all of the Azure components that you need to with permission so that you as a developer can start using that in your application going forward. I've already got one created. You are only allowed 1 per tenant, so that's going to fail on me. I don't want to show you a failure message, but that will get going, right? There is some throttling that happens when you create the trial container type. Naturally, it's a trial, and there's a 10 gig limit for documents that are in there. But again, just kicking the tires, getting started, everything is there that you need to. Once you have that created, now you're going to be able to go in and look at what are the permissions that you have in the trial container type. What are containers that have been created? So that's the big thing. So when we talk about containers, this is where the documents go. Literally a container, one site collection with one document library. In your application, you can have millions of containers. Okay? Each container holds 25 terabytes of content. So you got a lot of stuff that you can store in there. Okay. A couple things that are really important to note is when you're setting up some permissions, you can get local admin consent at the container level. But from a configuration perspective, what you're going to need to get the bearer token to authenticate into your application is that container type ID and the tenant. And these are going to be important here in just a minute. If you want to now give us delegated access to get our bearer token that basically is the keys to the front door of the house here, that allows us to make all of the Graph API calls that we need to going forward. But those are some important things that we're going to focus on here in just a second. Okay. All right. So now that you've got that created, what happens? What happened behind the scenes? So I always want to walk through some of the moving parts from an enterprise architecture perspective, so you know where to troubleshoot. And I'm going to go into, first of all, the Azure Billing Center. Let's see, we're going to go to Azure. We're going to go to Entra. We're going to go to app registrations because that's what is creating behind the scenes. And if I look at my SPE legal app registration, a couple notable things. Again, that client ID. If you're familiar with Azure, that's going to be pretty familiar. And the tenant ID. Again, those things along with that container type ID, those three things are going to get you the right bearer token, provided that you have the appropriate API permissions. And this is where you're going to be creating that file storage container that's selected delegated permission. That's critical. If you don't have that, we're not getting anywhere. Okay, so there's delegated, there's also application permissions if you want to use that on behalf of the user. If you want to manage the environment, then the manage all and the container type management permissions are going to be required too. So if you're creating additional container types, if you're creating some permissions to manage that registration process and so forth, you're going to need those as well. Okay, so those are critical. The only other thing that I'll mention from an app registration perspective is when you're creating that app, you're going to need to enter in the redirect URL of the app that you're creating. So another security boundary to making sure that your application has access to the Azure environment and the token that is being issued. And we'll see this here in just a second when I go into a sample app. Okay, so from an Azure perspective, make sure that that is configured. So we're going to get that bearer token that we need. If you want to use a secret, naturally you can create that secret, put it into your application, usually in the key vault, and have that be used for authentication as well. Normally, we recommend using the delegated permission so that we have user context. So if I go in to edit a file, great, I'm in the audit log. Samir goes in to edit a file, deletes a file, he's in the audit log, period. Okay, so you have context of the user. All right, so that's what happens in Azure. What happens in SharePoint? So if we go to SharePoint Admin Center, you're going to see the SharePoint Embedded node on the left-hand side, active archive delete containers as you would suspect. And you'll also see that as I create new containers, you're going to see that appear in the SharePoint Admin Center. Okay, so teaser is we are releasing the ability to create new applications in the SharePoint Admin Center with, like I said, within the next 30 days. So literally there's going to be a new application link. Go to the application link, hit create, give it a name, give it a subscription, hit go, you're there. Okay. If you've been through that onboarding process today, I've tried to help you through that with some PowerShell scripts. If you're comfortable with PowerShell, you're good to go. If you're not comfortable with PowerShell, then you give me a call. This is going to free up my day dramatically, right? You'll have the total control, the total ability to do that within SharePoint Admin Center. So I'm like, if nobody else is super excited about this, I'm super excited about this. So, but just a couple things with regards to managing the containers in the SharePoint Admin Center. I'm going to click on one that I've already got created, and naturally the container name is there. The container URL, we'll put that in our back pocket for a little bit, and we'll come back to that. But then you can see, specific metric information. If you want to assign permissions at the container level because you're the SharePoint admin, and Samir decided to move on and there's no owner of the container, naturally they can go in and do that. But what they can't do is see the content. Okay, so this is specific. We don't want to have like a content explorer or anything like that, because one of the benefits of SharePoint Embedded, isolated storage, control the content surfacing through your application. And we'll see that here in a second. Last thing we'll touch on is sensitivity labels. SharePoint Embedded, first-class citizen in purview. Apply that sensitivity label. New documents that go into the container inherit that, as you would expect. Okay. All right. Everything that I just mentioned here, with the exception of that sensitivity label, accessible through the API as well. All right. We have a application. We have containers. We have places to put documents. So I want to walk through what an application may look like. Like I tell people, APIs are great, but they're kind of hard to see, right? So let's kind of see what that API can do. So what I've done is I've created a legal application, and I'm going to go ahead and log out here because I'm going to show the interaction with Entra. Okay, so as I'm logging out of my application, great, everything is there. This is where you can control that login experience. So as I'm logging in, it's prompting me for credentials. And it's going to say, hey, who do you want to log in as? I'm going to log in here, great. And that is a member user in my tenant. So member users, guest users, all supported, but through Entra. So if you've got MFA, if you've got conditional access, if you've got PIM, whatever configurations you have in Entra, all of those are absolutely at play. Sensitivity labels, absolutely at play. If I'm a guest user and I have a sensitivity label targeting that guest user, then that sensitivity label configuration prevails. Okay. All right. You'll notice that on the left-hand side, I've got what represents a case in my example. Case, nothing more than a container. So we saw this in the SharePoint Admin Center where I created that new container. I gave it a friendly name because I need to identify and readily, acknowledge what is in that content. So create a case. When you create a new case or create a new container, it creates that new container in the SharePoint Admin Center. Also, you can assign the permissions to that container as well. So you'll notice I've got 2 cases that I have permission to. If there were 50 cases in here, security trimmed down to the 2 that I have access to. That obviously is one of the benefits of using the container architecture to secure that. Okay. I've also decided in my case that I'm going to use folders to organize my content. Containers also have the ability to have metadata on them. So text, any of the field types that you have in SharePoint are going to be supported there. We don't support content types or the term store. Okay, so big differentiation there. But if you want to have a date or integer, people picker, choice fields, all of those are things that you can configure at the container level so that when you're adding documents in, add the metadata to the document as you would suspect, and that will prevail through the experience as well. Okay.
So Steve, question. Do we
Yes,
have
sir.
like a control library that we can use? Like, hey, this is a list view or like a document library view, rather than like having to create that on our own? Is there something like that?
So there is an endpoint that you can say, give me all of the containers that I have access to, and then you can display that however you want.
Okay.
Yep. So again, you're creating the UI. We're providing the backend APIs to support that. So that UI can look however you want it to look. If you want to have a list of containers in a dashboard, I like it, right? If you want to have a list of cases on the left with documents on the right, I like it.
Okay.
Your application, your design.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Gotcha.
We'll dive into a couple of those APIs here in a second, but yeah, absolutely. All right. So in this case, I've created my container for the case. I've got documents that go in there. If I click on the folder, naturally, I see the documents on the right-hand side. I've decided that this is the interface that I want to provide folks. And a couple notable things that I'm going to show is if I enable or select one document, now the toolbar lights up. So like I tell people, because you're controlling that user interface, if you don't want people to delete documents, don't put the delete button on the interface, right? It's kind of that simple, right? If you do want to, then yeah, when they delete it, it's going to go to the recycle bin for 93 days because it's a site collection in a library, and you have control over the recycle bin. After that, it goes, it's deleted, gone, just like you would expect from that recycle bin activity, okay? A couple of key things here from a SharePoint Embedded perspective is the ability to edit it online or in the desktop. So as I'm adding documents into the container, I have the typical landing zone where I can drag and drop files, browse my local machine, normal things there. We have a migration API that will get content into the containers in mass quantities. If I wanted to create a new file or folder, here I can create that new Word Office document and so forth. So content gets into the container a number of different ways, right? But once it's in that container, now we have the ability to interact with it. So if it is a typical Office document, if I click on the document, you'll see on the right-hand side, I've got a viewer that pops up and it will display the content of the document. So this is simply a viewer. No interaction to it or anything like that. And come on, viewer. It'll pop here in a second. So, yeah, well, we'll give it there. It is. Okay. So now we've got the document that comes up and the ability to, again, view the document. If we wanted to edit the document, you can hit the edit button there, obviously. But if I go to my edit online or desktop, so if you edit it online, pop it into a different tab, it's going to load the document in full Office. So this is nothing different than any Office document that you use in Outlook, Excel, or Teams, whatever the case is there, right? So full, sensitivity labels, version history, app mentions, comments, blah, blah, blah. Everything is right there, okay? The way that does that, and once we get into the API here in a second, is there is an attribute in this JSON output called web URL. And web URL is simply wrap an href around that or have it interact with that edit online, pop it into a new tab. That web URL has all the information that it needs to launch the document into Office and the respective viewer, right? Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Visio, blah, blah, blah. That's all you need. So from a developer perspective, it's like super simple. What container am I in? What folder am I in? Because I can navigate up and down folder structures, right? I have a parent folder if I want to navigate up. I have subfolders if I want to navigate down. So you need to keep track of where you're at in the hierarchy, and I call it walking the tree up and down. But then you're displaying documents. That web URL attribute in the JSON file is your friend. Pop that in and display that. Okay. So editing is fairly straightforward. If I want to share it, there's a share endpoint as well that I can share with specific people. So here I want to share with my Hotmail account. Great, I'm going to create that link and that person is going to get a link to that document. So since I specifically shared it with this person, that person is the only one that has access to it, period. So as they click on the link, it's going to confirm that this person is the one clicking on it via Entra, and we're good to go. So if I send this to Samir sends it to Mohammed, and you guys haven't been shared on this, you're going to get an access denied. Okay? So, and that'll pop them into the viewer, as you would suspect. But then you can also see, who this is shared with. So if I click on the shared with link, now I can see that, oh, hey, I shared with externally, and they can view that. Or I've shared the link with a few other folks as well. Okay, so again, using the API in the interface to make it super simple for the user to view who shared it, view the documents, view the versions, things like that. Okay. All right. A couple more features, and then we're going to dive into the API a little bit deeper. If I look at, I'm going to unselect the document, but if I look at the case summary in this case, so now on the right-hand side, I have a pop-out that says, hey, what's the summary of this case? Who are the key people, key dates, things like that. So this is where we're using the retrieval API to ground ourselves on content that's in the container that I focused on. So in this instance, I have a case, right, container that has documents in it. I'm going to go through, and I know that there's certain documents that have the filing of the case. So I'm going to focus on that. It's going to summarize that so that the attorney, whoever, can see that specific information. But then I'm also going to go through and parse out, hey, who's the judge? Who's the prosecuting counsel? Who's the defense attorney? Blah, blah, blah. So I've got all of that right here at my fingertips. What are the key dates? Who appealed it? What are the motions? What are the subpoena dates? Things like that. Okay. So now you can start to see, using the retrieval API grounded on that content, what that starts to look like. And we'll show that here in a second. Okay. Naturally, we got to talk about Copilot. Again, if I have in this specific instance, I'm using the Foundry agent that's grounded on my knowledge source being SharePoint embedded content. Okay, so now if I have some key phrases that I want to use to prompt the user to get information back, just like a normal Copilot experience, have a chat with that customer, have a chat with that document, or have a chat with the contents of this container. So now if I look at the context, I'm in this container. I'm not in the other container, meaning I have context to this case. So if I wanted to say, who was the deciding judge? Now it's going to go and it's going to look at the documents that are in that container, i.e. case, and it's going to come back to say, yeah, Maria Lopez is the judge that's in the container. So again, normal Copilot interaction that you're using on content in SharePoint Embedded against that Foundry agent. So now that you've created that Foundry agent, hey, maybe there's some other external data sources you want to pull in addition to the SharePoint Embedded content. Great. Put it in there. The agent is now going to do what Foundry does and pull all that together and reason over it accordingly. Okay. So pretty cool stuff there. All right. Okay, so the last thing I want to show, and I'm kind of excited about this, is I'm selecting a document. And I hit to tell the story of the document. So now it's using the Azure OpenAI service to go and, hey, summarize the document, which is great. But it's also getting the last 5 versions of the document, and it's putting that in chronological order so that I can see what's the story that this document is taking on, right? I created it originally. Samir went in there, added some really cool stuff on, what have you. Mohammed opened that up. So it kind of takes a life of its own, right? And now we're able to determine, okay, yeah, this is great. I've went in, I've modified this, I've added some details. I'm kind of telling a little bit of that story on what happens. Okay, so this is kind of taking version history to the next level using some AI capabilities that really save you personally just I think a ton of time, right? So this is pretty cool. Something similar, I gotta show you this too because this is like totally way cool on the version history, right? So again, we mentioned version history. By default, when you create a container, it's got 500 versions of it. But now I'm going to select, hey, what are the 2 versions I'm going to look at, right? So if I look at my timeline, yeah, I've got a few things. Actually, I'm going to go down here because I'm just playing with this before the call. I've got a progress report. And I'm going to go into my versions of this progress report. And I'm going to select, I don't know, these two versions, right? Because Diego was modifying this for a while. Oh, Diego modified it again. But if I compare the two versions, we're going to see, the side by side. But I'm also going to see what is the activity that happened in between those versions. Okay. So Diego put some comments. He mentioned somebody, he edited, he decided to share it with somebody. But also I went in and made some edits too. So in between versions, what is the activities that happened? And display that to the user so that they have from a compliance perspective, it's kind of cool. Saves you from going to the audit log to saying, okay, well, I got to create this audit log job and I have to put the dates in, blah, blah, blah. Now we can display that right within context. Again, it'll come in and determine, hey, what are some of the key changes that happen? So it's taking the deltas of the two documents and now adding some updated information from the content that it was analyzing. Okay, so again, using some of the Azure OpenAI stuff with the versioning, telling the bit of activity of what's going on there, all within one place of the application. Okay, all right.
Yeah,
cool.
Just to say, Steve, this is amazing. I'm just looking at it and I'm like, wow, mind-boggling. My jaw is like dropped, like, oh my God.
Yeah, I got this. I'll be totally transparent, right? I went into Copilot and I'm says, hey, I'm creating this application and I want some really cool killer features that are in here. What do you got? And it came back with a half dozen of them, and I'm like, I don't like any of those. But this one kind of stuck. So I've just been kind of building on this for the last couple of weeks now. So
Definitely, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. All good. So, all right. Okay. So that's what in a nutshell, what my app does. Create your app as you need to, right? But let's get into a couple of a bit of a details here, right? Because Mohammed, you had mentioned that, hey, what if I want to have a dashboard that I can see only the containers and then navigate in from there? We have a number of project management customers that use it exactly for that, right? So where do I get that stuff? So I'm going to switch over to Bruno, and Bruno is the tool that I use for API calls. I think a lot of people use Postman. At Microsoft, we're not allowed to use Postman for, I don't know, whatever reason. So I use Bruno. It's an endpoint API that you can call, right? Again, the first thing that we need to do, we need to get that bearer token. So now, in true fashion, I'm getting the authorization code. I'm using the OAuth 2 functionality to get that bearer token. Pass in, the authorization URL, client ID, if you have a client secret, the scope, right? So again, that file storage container.selected, that's your friend. You have to have that. If you don't have that, you're going to get a bunch of 403s, okay? And then, just simply get the access token. We got a new access token, all is good. And if we wanted to see the configuration of that, naturally you can. I've got a script that's going to propagate that token to all my commands. But you'll notice I've got a laundry list of commands that I've used, right, over the last couple of years. But if I hit that list containers, you'll notice that I have within my container type ID. So I have an F-15 flying overhead for some reason. So all right, I think we're good. When we created our SharePoint embedded environment, that container type ID is our application. So that's kind of critical. And that's nothing more than configuration at that point. Think of it as a manifest file for all the containers that we have. So if we pass in that container type ID, now we're going to get a list of all our containers, and you can see the two containers that I've created that we saw previously, right? This container ID is your friend. Okay, so I'm going to grab that, and I've got some environment variables that we'll put it into and so forth. But that would be the list of the containers that you would display on a dashboard, for instance. Okay. And then as you're navigating into the files, so that's your launch point, if you will. If I wanted to get a list of files, now, if I look at the endpoint, it's going to say, okay, great. There could be there could be 5 million containers in my application. Which container do you want to get to? So that's where take the container ID from the previous call, pass that into the endpoint, and now we're going to get all of the items in the root of that container. Okay, so that's the big part, right? Is to say, okay, I'm getting everything in the root, and you'll notice that I've got a lot of stuff coming back, obviously. But if I go down to, let's see, I think I've got a PDF here. Yeah, but I don't have a docx here. I do have a docx here. Okay, so within that container at the root level, I've got this barcode separator docx file, which is great. But remember I told you about that web URL value? That's what you want to get after. So that will be your href that people click on to launch it into a new tab and display the document in Word in this case. Excel, obviously displays in Excel and so forth. Okay, so that's your create. If you take nothing out of what I just showed you, that's how easy it is to launch that document into a new experience. Okay. And then naturally, you've got a series of other metadata, but that document ID that's created is also your friend too. Okay, so that's going to be, hey, I want to display a side panel that has the metadata. Great. What's the document ID so that I can get the metadata associated with this document? So it's the ID that you would normally expect from adding a document to a folder. The parent reference, again, remember that we need to navigate up or down, walk the tree in our environment. So if I'm 3 folders deep, what's the parent folder that I need to go up to? That gets me the URL to the parent folder, walk up, now display all the files that are in that parent folder and so forth. So now you've got your navigation capabilities that are in there. Okay. And if I go a little bit further down, now I've got, if you're familiar with if you've ever dug into the SharePoint SQL database, that file leaf ref should look familiar. It's a SharePoint database, right? So yeah, so you'll be able to see some familiar things there. Obviously, don't do that because locks happen and bad things go sideways. So, but you've got the metadata that we've surfaced here that you can use in the application. Okay. All right. So from a container perspective, great. Let's get the container information. And there's a number of things that you can do from a container perspective. If you wanted to create new containers, if you wanted to apply permission to containers, you wanted to enable OCR on a container, all of those things are available from endpoints as well. Okay, so that's containers. Files, again, when we looked at the creating that invite or that file sharing permission, right? So we have a file that we want to share with somebody internally or externally. Great, where's the file? It's got to be in a container somewhere, and the file has an ID. So we're going to pass in the container ID, the file ID, and the invite endpoint. So with the invite endpoint, now we have to specify what are the parameters that we want to share that file with that external user. Okay. Do we want them to require sign-on? Do we want to send an invitation? So again, the parameters that go into the graph endpoint in the request body, that's got to be something that you have in your interface, or you're coding that when they hit the create link button or the share button, whatever you want to name it, right? So options, okay? If you want to create only an edit link, great. And you're going to hard code that to edit versus write, all is good, okay? So main thing here is know the parameters of the API. That guides you into what the interface may or may not look like. So now you can have that experience that you're looking for when you're creating that application. And there's a number of things that you can do with that as well. So if I wanted to, I don't know, create a folder, okay? Where am I creating it? What container am I creating it in? What's the name of the folder? and are there any parameters here? So in this case, there's no parameters. Okay. So now, naturally, if I'm creating a folder, I got one entry box that says, what do you want to name it? And it knows context of where it is. Okay. So if I'm, 4 folders deep, I need to provide context of where I'm at. I'm not at the root anymore. I'm buried down into a subfolder somewhere. Okay. So again, maintaining that context as you're going through, and you'll know that based on how you're walking the tree and finding those folders. Okay. Metadata scenarios. You can create metadata at the container level, and then you can set the currency value again. So here I've got a document in a container. I've got a piece of metadata that I've created for the invoice number, and I'm going to set that to a certain value. Okay. So in another example, I have a Power Automate function that when a document is dropped into a container, I have a trigger on Power Automate, takes that document. In this case, it's an invoice, sends it to Power Platform, runs the invoice pre-built model, returns back the JSON metadata. Now I parse that and I update the metadata in the container. Okay. So metadata's got to be at the container. Use the automation mechanism that you want to automatically populate that going forward. Okay. All right. Okay. So I think we get an idea of what the APIs look like. Again, container ID is your friend, item ID or object ID, folder file. How do I want to navigate through our hierarchy? What activities do I want to perform on that file or folder or container? All of those, follow a similar pattern from an API perspective. Consult the documentation for specific request body details. It's all listed there that will supply that. Okay. All right. So APIs, your friend. Obviously, that's what's going to drive everything. So a couple other things I want to focus on. I know we got a good amount of time here. You'll notice that I've created everything in my React application. Full disclosure, I use Lovable to vibe code the whole thing. So this is great, right? We're coming out with an MCP server that you can plug into your favorite coding mechanism, Claude, Codex, Lovable, Built, Replit, whatever the case is there. There's one now in aka.ms/spe-samples that you can use in Lovable Bolt Codex right now. And it will allow you to focus on the APIs that are published and use that within your app. But we're having a more standard one come out later on. But again, what I've heard a lot of people do is take the root URL to docs, put that into your agentic tool, and start asking questions, right? I want to delete a document. I want to see the versions of a document. I want to download it. Everything that you want to do on that document, the docs are there. The agents understand how to interpret the docs. There's code samples in there. 30 seconds later, you've got your button that works, right? Literally. So, so absolutely play with that and make sure that that works for you. So, but I'm going to switch over to Power Platform really quick, because now if you're a Power Platform person and you got no idea what that graph stuff that I just told you about is, no problem, right? So this is an app that I've created that is literally, focused on the projects that we have. Okay, is it playing nice with us today? I think so. Okay, so let's do that. Oh, that's good. Let's do. Okay, we'll let that fire here for a second. But there's the Power app that will focus on using the APIs or the Power Platform connectors to do pretty much everything that I've showed you in the React application. So we'll let that fire here, give it like 2 more seconds. And yeah, we're gonna do that. We're gonna skip that. And she's gonna load up. And yeah, that's good. Okay, so while that's going, over in Power Platform, or Power Automate, I should say, we have a number of connectors that are going to be used to connect to that Canvas app that I've created. So if I wanted to get a, I don't know, let's get containers, right? So if I edit the get containers activity, now you're going to see it's invoked by the button click in Power Apps, but it's going to go and it's going to, yeah, get my connection to there. Oops. This guy. There we go. And what's it going to need? It's going to need that container type ID. So again, when you created that SharePoint embedded environment, you're going to get that container type ID, and it's going to list all of the containers for that container type ID. So you've got all the containers containers now. Here are all of the Power Automate activities that you can do in SharePoint Embedded. Okay, so there's 47 of those that do all of those CRUD operations. So again, if that graph stuff scared you earlier that we talked about, but you know, hey, I want to get some files. I want to check out a file. I want to delete a file. I want to do those file operations. Great. Use those file operations. Okay. We've also got triggers that will react when you add a file or modify a file in a container. So you add a new file in a container, the trigger activates, use the connectors to do what connectors do, right? Put that together and execute on that. Okay, so let's see if this guy is going. Yeah. Okay. Oh, shoot. Okay. Well, we're going to bail on this for a second. So, not sure. Yeah. Okay. From a container perspective, obviously, when you're hitting the containers and executing that is going to call that activity. It's going to come back and it's going to show the containers that are there. Okay. But again, executing those Power Automate activities, like you normally would suspect, that's going to be feeding that result into the Power App, returning that as JSON, so you can use the parse JSON functionality just as you would normally do, and pull out the information and display that within the screen as well. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on from there. I'm going to focus a little bit more on Copilot Studio. So within Copilot Studio, we have the ability to create agents, obviously, and the knowledge source of the agent can also be SharePoint embedded content. Okay. So if I add my knowledge to an agent, this is where, when we created that container, I told you to put this URL in your back pocket. Okay. Come on now. Grab that URL as soon as it behaves here. All right, we'll let that pop here in a second.
The URL which was on the container in admin center.
Correct. Yep. Okay. So in that URL, let's see it coming up now. Here we go. All right. So I have my active containers. And if I were to look at the container URL, so for the SharePoint folks in the room, which I think there's many of us, the content storage is the managed path. And the CSP underscore blah, blah, blah is the GUID to that site collection. Okay. So if I grab that, copy that, and if I go back to Copilot Studio, now I can put in that URL. Okay. And I can add that. And it's going to give you a red message that I'm in the process of changing that to green because red is bad, right? So I'm going to add that anyway. And that is going to be a knowledge source that we're going to use within our agent. Okay. So if I wanted to have context to just that one container that has my documents in it, great. if I wanted to have context to everything in the application, then star is your friend, which I think is what we have here. Yep. So now I'm using everything in that container or in the application. Okay. So that's how we would contextualize that. So once we save that, once we publish that, now we're able to use agents and iterate over that knowledge as you would suspect. Okay. In addition to that, if we focus on the topics portion of it, so actually I'm going to go back to my here, let's go here. Yep. And if I go to topics, so what I've done in the topics is I've got an upload file to SharePoint Embedded, and that will interact with the user. So now we can go and have specific questions and kind of configure that topic as we need to. But one of the things that I wanted to focus on is within the topic, if we look at the properties of this question where we're asking the user for the file to upload, now and the entity recognition, make sure we include that file metadata. So now we have context of the file bits. We have a context to the name of the file. Remember that graph endpoint that we need to call within SharePoint Embedded. What's it need? Got to give it a name. We got to have a byte64 stream on what the content of the file is. That's where we need to enable that metadata in Copilot Studio. So once we do that, now we're going to call this file upload action. Okay. So when we call the file upload action, I thought I had it here. Yeah, okay. So that's going to create another, or call that tool. And this is simply the Power Automate activities that we saw earlier. Okay. So the name of the file, the bits of the file, all of that is going to be passed into the activity. And we're able to see that in our tool. So now I've got again, some variables that I've set specific to what's the folder in the container ID, right? I got a file coming in. Where's it going to go? It's got to go into a container somewhere. I'm going to put it into a folder. Maybe I'm going to put it in my invoices folder or the root folder. Your decision, right? So now that I've created that file, right? Where's it going? What's a container in? What's that file name? Again, coming from the metadata of the agent that we created, and that base64 string is the bits that are going into it. So now I'm creating that file. I'm getting that file information back. I'm going to send that over to AI Builder. I'm going to parse the contents of that, but then I'm going to update the metadata of that file. So again, where's the file? I need to have my container ID, the file ID. So that was created when I added that to the container. And now I've got metadata on that container, invoice number, vendor name, as you see, populated with what was parsed from the AI Builder pre-built model, simple JSON, or not JSON, but just properties that were returned from that activity. Populate that. Now you have metadata that's been automatically extracted associated with that file. If you go to the application, I'm going to go to invoices here. I just happen to know that Johnson & Associates has metadata associated to that. So I'm going to see the PDF pop here in a second, which is great. But if I go to properties on that, normal file property information, just like you would suspect, here's the invoice amount, invoice number, invoice date, vendor name, so forth, right? So it took it from invoice number, invoice date, customer name, took it from that pre-built model, populated it here. Life is good. Okay. So all of that by having the contractor drop an invoice into a Teams chat message or wherever I publish the agent so that I can receive that information back. Okay. So again, your workflow, your agent, call it whatever makes sense to you.
Right. Lifesaver. Yeah.
Huge, right? I mean, yeah. So awesome. Using the connectors, using Copilot Studio, all of that, putting it together. So yeah, that's good stuff. All right. Okay, so let's graduate into Foundry for a second. So in Foundry, this is where, again, let's reground ourselves. If I go to my Copilot chat, I want to ground my content on the SharePoint embedded documents that are in this container, for instance. So that's going to be my knowledge source. So back in Foundry, I've created a new agent, legal docs. And let's see, from a knowledge perspective, this is where I have the ability to add that knowledge. So if I go to my knowledge sources on the left, I'm going to create a knowledge base. So this, again, bear with the interface and the ability to configure it. But if you go to SharePoint Remote, we're going to connect to that. And now it's going to give us the name of the Azure resource. But under the advanced options, container type ID. Okay, so again, when we created that SharePoint embedded application, it's going to give us that container type ID that has all of our containers and documents in there. Drop that in, you're going to know that. And then you can also specify what are the fields that you want to index and filter on as well, right? So notice that, hey, filter expression looks KQL-ish, right? It is. But remember, we're in a SharePoint subsystem, if you will, isolated content. But from a search perspective, from a filter perspective, KQL is still your friend. Okay, so all of those core criteria still apply to a SharePoint embedded container. Okay, so once we create that, now we have that knowledge source available to us in our agent. And here's my SPE legal docs knowledge that we just configured. Yes, sir.
How does it get access, authenticate to that container?
Yep, excellent question. When you're configuring, I'm going to go back to here. Actually, I'm going to go back to here. So when you're configuring the endpoint to publish it, one of the things that is going to be required, again, is that bearer token. Okay, so as you're hitting this endpoint, it's also going to look for the bearer token with that file storage container that's selected in the call that you're making here. That is going to be passed into the OAuth 2 configuration for the agent as well. So it knows to say, okay, now I have access to the content and I'm able to return that back because it's got that bearer token context.
Okay.
Okay. Yep. And this is going to be what you're going to use in your application to call the endpoint and also the Azure OpenAI endpoint. Conveniently, when I did my summary in my version functionality, that's the endpoint that it's using to call the summarization and the parsing mechanism in Azure OpenAI. So this is serving.
Doesn't the Foundry here need to authenticate on its own to SharePoint Embedded before you make the call to Foundry?
Yeah, so you'll have to authenticate to SharePoint Embedded first, get that bearer token, and then you can make the call into Foundry so that it has context into the containers to reason over. Okay. Cool. All right. So I'm going to pause there. I think we've been all over the bot here, guys. So
which is great. It was
Yes.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to open the toolbox to everything that we've had. One thing that I do want to, I just thought of this is when we looked at the case summary, that's using the retrieval API. So real quick on the retrieval API, I'm going to go back to Bruno here really quick. And if I go to Copilot, now we have the retrieval API endpoint, right? So now this is the retrieval API endpoint, and the body of it is a little different than the SharePoint retrieval API. So now, obviously, data source SharePoint embedded and the container type ID. So back to that container type ID, right? But in the query string or the instructions, I've specifically focused on that case and context that's in that case. So the instructions that you pass into the retrieval API, huge, so that you get back the right context to that information. Okay.
And
And
current
run
user
that.
doesn't need to have like Copilot license for the retrieval API, right?
At the retrieval API.
Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
exactly. Yep. And then you're going to get back a bunch of, content that you're going to parse, basically. So regular expressions in this case are going to be your friend to get out, dates and things like that. So, yep. Okay. All right. So wanted to make sure that we talked about that as is being incorporated into, again, the application itself. So I'm making that API call. I'm getting the response back. I'm parsing that out, and I'm doing what I want my interface to display.
So question, Steve.
Yeah.
If you go like to step 0 and like the decision making, why would someone go for SharePoint embedded containers rather than like going for a SharePoint site collection and just do single part app pages like an SPFX and just like have a single page application and do something exactly like this for internal employees? Why would you go for SharePoint embedded in that case?
You got it. No, get a question every day, right? So one of the main reasons is you got control over that user interface, obviously, right? But you have sensitive content that you want to control as well. So we have a customer that has 6,000 people using an application to interact with client data, right? Naturally, 6,000 site collections potentially, but if they go in, I call it the back door, right? They know the site URL, they go in the back door, they get into SharePoint, and they're like, I'm going to delete this document library, or I'm going to modify this metadata, or I'm going to change permissions, right? Because, they binged it or Copilot it and says, hey, this is how you do it. All of a sudden the application breaks. Okay, so now you got 6,000 people that are dead in the water because somebody decided to go in and mess with the structure of the application, right? Or they want to have a consistent user interface that is totally controlled by the application. So if you edit a document, naturally you're going to have contribute rights on that, but you don't want to delete the document. Well, too bad. They can still delete the document. So it's back to the control and back to the isolation of content. And that's primarily the number one reason that customers use SharePoint Embedded and not SharePoint. They want to get away from that. Okay? They don't want their content in the M365 search. I'm dealing with patent information that's super sensitive, right? Legal documents, client matter. Plus, we saw that I have the ability to share and collaborate externally with people. If you do that in a SharePoint environment, you got to boost up the sharing in the SharePoint Admin Center. And most organizations are like, I don't think so, right? But with SharePoint Embedded, you can flip a PowerShell setting on the container type to say, I'm going to share only this container type externally, not affecting anything else in the tenant. Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So back to my legal stuff, right? Obviously, we have external counsel and whoever is going to contribute to this. If that sharing mechanism isn't there, you're back to the old, attaching a document to an email, losing control method, right? No good there.
So let's say like if we're like creating a product for companies like this one, and we want to sell it to multiple law firm organizations, can I replicate the containers and say, okay, I have a new client, I'm going to replicate this container for this client. I have another client, is there something?
Perfect scenario, right? You create a whiz-bang application, you want to put it in the marketplace, and you're going to sell it, right? You want to maintain control of the billing, maybe not, right? To say, okay, I'm going to bill my customer for the consumption, storage, API calls, and egress, plus a management fee or service fee. So when you put that in the marketplace, somebody buys that and they register it in their tenant, containers are in their tenant. The code is still on your side. You're managing the code, but they're managing, it manages the containers in their tenant. So falls under Purview, falls under Entra, falls under all of the M365 governance that they have in their tenant and their documents, because you don't want their documents in your tenant, right? And they don't want their documents in your tenant, more importantly, right? So they maintain the governance, but when you're doing a code push, they get the benefits of that code because you're using it in a distributed model. Yep.
Cool.
Okay. So,
Nice.
all right, cool.
This
All right,
is
guys.
great.
Yeah, I know we're at time. I need to jump here in a second, but yeah.
Yeah.
Again, thanks so much, Samir. Mohammed, this is fantastic. I love just, no slides, going under the hood, telling everybody
Yep.
exactly what's happening here.
That's the whole idea. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. Steve, thank
Yeah.
you so much. That was back with real and practical value. I'll tell you, I started making notes starting from that available apps, then Bruno, and then Power Automate, and then Foundry and Copal Studio. Oh my God, like it is
Yeah.
all over, right? And
Yeah.
we truly appreciate your sharing your time and expertise today. And
Sure.
thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
Awesome. No, my pleasure, guys. No, hope we can do it again soon. So
Yeah,
cool.
sure.
Thank you,
All right.
Steve. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Yep. Cheers.
Yeah.